And we're back for another arousing lecture for Concepts of Anatomy and Physiology. This is Dr. Jenkins. I'm excited as always. Not sure how you're feeling, but that's okay. This chapter is all about the muscular system. And it makes sense because we just finished the skeletal system and the bones and the muscles work together, right? This is how we contract our muscles to move the bones and allow for all sorts of movement. Right? So here we go. Here's our outline. We are going to go through quite a bit of anatomy, and then we are going to get into some pretty detailed physiology of the muscle contraction, and then we'll end with learning some of the muscles themselves. Here we go. So, usually when we think about muscles, we're talking about the skeletal muscles. These are the muscles that are attached to bone. We also have muscle tissue in our heart, right? Our heart walls are made up of muscle tissue. And we also have muscle tissue, for example, in the walls of our GI tract. And that's called smooth muscle. But by and large, most of the time we're thinking about skeletal muscle. The biceps, the triceps, the hamstrings, the quads, the muscles that attach to bone. We have over 600 skeletal muscles. You are not going to be asked to know anywhere near that number. Just pointing it out, we have a lot. So the primary function of these skeletal muscles, of any kind of muscle really, is movement, right? The muscle contracts, shortens, and because the ends of the muscle attach to bones, when this muscle shortens, because it attaches to bone, it'll pull up this bone segment. Indeed, this is an example of a lever system, where we have some kind of axis of rotation or joint, and it is the effort of the muscles that moves a segment. So movement. I mentioned smooth muscle. So in addition to just general movement of our limbs, we have smooth muscle in the walls of our GI tract. We have smooth muscle in the walls of our arteries. And really, it says here, move blood or move food. We could probably use a better term, propulsion. So whether it's smooth muscle contracting in the arterial wall to propel blood, or it's smooth muscle in the small intestine wall to propel food, or the esophagus wall through peristalsis to push the food down, that's the way I'd like to think about smooth muscle, propulsion. And then of course we have cardiac muscle, which is the muscle of the heart wall, and that helps to pump blood out of the heart. All right, so from here on out, we're going to be talking almost primarily about the skeletal muscle. This is the muscle tissue that attaches to bone, not smooth, not cardiac. At the very end of this lecture, we will be talking about smooth and cardiac briefly. If I was going to just tell you a tidbit now, skeletal and cardiac muscle are very similar. Smooth muscle is a little bit different in its structure. But indeed, we're going to focus on the skeletal muscle, the muscle that attaches to bone, and it looks like this, right? Here's the big muscle, and then it's smaller and smaller parts. Okay. Even though we're going to be focusing on skeletal, I do want to remind you, we touched upon these in the tissues chapter. Isn't it nice how everything builds together? See, that was by design. Sometimes we know what we're doing. So you may recall, skeletal muscle has these vertical striations. Cardiac muscle also has the vertical striations, but there's a little bit more space in between the fibers. And of course, cardiac muscle has these dark bands every so often. Smooth muscle does not have the vertical striations, and its edges are smooth. Skeletal is the most common, striated as we talked about, and skeletal muscle is the only muscle tissue we have that is voluntarily controlled. If you want to contract your quadricep muscle group, you voluntarily do so. You think of the idea, then your brain will voluntarily send a nerve impulse down to the muscles to cause contraction. The other two muscle tissues, like smooth muscle, are involuntary. That means that the brain will send the nerve impulses for you, right? These muscles need a nerve impulse into them to contract no matter what type of muscle tissue it is. But if it's a skeletal muscle, you voluntarily initiate that nerve impulse from your brain. Whereas if it's smooth or cardiac muscle, that nerve impulse is initiated for you. So it's involuntary. So smooth muscle, no striations, smooth edges found in the walls of the GI tract, involuntarily controlled, propels substances. And then cardiac is striated, it's found in the walls of the heart, but is of course involuntarily controlled, which is probably a good thing. If I had to remember 60 to 80 times a minute to tell my heart to contract voluntarily, I would inevitably forget, and then I wouldn't have blood being pumped to my body. So, all right. So here we go. We're going to go through the structure, and we're going to focus on the skeletal muscle. It's what we have the most of. Okay. I prefer to start big and then work our way smaller and smaller, microscopically. The whole darn thing is the muscle. The muscle is made up of these circular groupings called fascicles. So each one of these is a fascicle. So here we've taken one fascicle and enlarged it. Now, each fascicle, I'm going to keep changing colors. Hopefully it'll make it easier for labeling. We'll do yellow. Each fascicle is made up of many, many, many muscle fibers. So each of these is a muscle fiber, right? So the whole muscle has these groupings, these circular groupings called fascicles. If we were to look at just one fascicle, each fascicle is made up of a grouping of these muscle fibers. Each muscle fiber is made up of smaller units called myofibrils. And now we're getting microscopic, right? Let's use purple. The smallest microscopic structures are called myofilaments. These are the smallest ones, smallest. They're important because these are the ones that are actually contractile. And, maybe you've heard of this before. We have actin, the thin myofilament, and myosin, the thick one. So you should be reviewing these. Either work big to small or small to large. I prefer to go big to small. So the whole skeletal muscle is made up of these circular groupings called fascicles. Each fascicle is made up of a grouping of muscle fibers. Each muscle fiber is made up of a grouping of myofibrils. And each myofibril is made up of the smallest microscopic contractile units called myofilaments. So, I'm just giving you more of the information here. The entire muscle, made up of groupings called fascicles. Each fascicle is made up of a grouping of muscle fibers. I'm changing colors here, I know. Each muscle fiber is made up of a grouping called myofibrils. And the smallest are the myofilaments. Now, some of these sound similar, muscle fiber, myofibril, myofilament. So you're going to have to spend some time with this because some of the words sound similar. But you can do it. It's just memorization. I mean, I don't mean to say it's just memorization, like it's easier to memorize all these things, but I'm saying it's straightforward, is what I'm saying. Here's what a skeletal muscle looks like under a microscope. Basically, if we were to take a cross-section of a whole muscle, it's pretty cool. The whole muscle would be all the way out here, and it has these groupings called fascicles. Each fascicle is made up of muscle fibers. All right. Okay. We're going to talk specifically about those muscle fibers. These are the yellow doodads in this picture. Muscle fibers. Really, muscle fibers are kind of like muscle cells. So if someone says a muscle cell, it's really this part of the muscle that they're talking about. Well, if we were to go back to this picture, and if we were to stain it a certain way, you could see that some of the muscle fibers would stain one color, maybe blue, and then other muscle fibers would stain a different color, yellow. Those aren't the real colors, but my point is, some muscle fibers stain one color, other muscle fibers stain another color. And the reason why is because we have two basic different types of muscle fibers. In this picture, the lighter ones are considered our fast twitch, or type 2. So every skeletal muscle is going to have some of the fast twitch, and every skeletal muscle, in this picture, they stain darker. Every muscle is always going to have some of the slow twitch. So every muscle is a combination of both. Now, certain muscles will have more of a type 1 versus a type 2 based on what they are. Make sure that you know the general differences between them. The fast twitch, these are better for short activities of high intensity. Think about a power lifter, right? This power lifter is going to utilize a lot of the short, high-intensity muscle fibers. So these fast-twitch muscle fibers are just slightly structurally modified, which makes them very good at short, high-intensity activities. On the other, or a sprinter, like a 100-meter sprinter, right? On the other hand, our slow-twitch fibers are better for the opposite, long-lasting, low-intensity. So a distance runner. A distance runner is going to utilize more of our slow twitch. So every skeletal muscle has both. Based on training, you can have more of one or the other a little bit. Also based on the specific muscle you're talking about. Right? Every muscle is made up of both types. So you're always utilizing a combination of both. But a sprinter, over here, or a power lifter, is going to have more type 2, fast twitch, good for short bouts of high intensity, whereas a marathon runner or a distance runner is going to have more type 2, lower intensity, but can stay contracted for longer. All right, so we spoke about the muscle fibers, or the muscle cells. Now we're going to go to the smallest ones, remember? We had the whole muscle, the fascicle, the myofibril, the muscle fiber, the myofibril, and then the myofilaments. See? Even I get it mixed up sometimes. So let's look at the smallest pieces. And I said these were actin and myosin. These are the contractile pieces. So check it out. We're talking about the smallest pieces. These are the contractile ones. In a moment, we're going to be talking about how a muscle contracts. and how a muscle contracts is something called the sliding filament theory. Check it out. Why is it called the sliding filament theory? Because we're looking at myofilaments that slide past each other to cause contraction. Okay, but we're going to talk about that more in a bit. Let's just focus now on some basic structure. Of the myofilaments, actin is the thin one. Here it's the yellow. And myosin is the thicker one, shown as red. I think about an actor usually has to be skinny. Well, particularly a female actor, right? So actin is thin. What we're going to find is that the actin and myosin, here's the actin, thin actin, and then let's do myosin in green. And here's the myosin. The myosin is the thicker one. So I'm making the myosin green, thick. And the actin is blue. Well, it turns out that the actin and myosin form this little horizontal unit where it's almost like, if you take your two hands and you have your fingers spread out and you almost interlock your fingers. Like you almost interlock the fingers of your right hand between the fingers of your left hand. Well, so they're close, but they're not quite touching, right? So here we can see that they're close, but they're not quite touching. This is what this horizontal unit of actin and myosin looks like at rest. If this muscle is not contracting, if it's at rest, the actin and myosin are arranged almost interlocking. Well, they are interlocking. They're just not quite touching yet. Okay, so this horizontal unit, right? One horizontal unit is called a sarcomere. So each individual unit is called a sarcomere. Here's one sarcomere. If we were to magnify it, it looks like this. But the myofibril is simply one set of myofilaments or one sarcomere next to another set of myofilaments. One set of myofilaments or sarcomere next to another, next to another. It goes down the whole length of the myofibril. So at rest, this horizontal unit of actin and myosin interlocking, which is called the sarcomere, this horizontal unit, at rest, there's a space in between here. When a muscle contracts, the actin and myosin slide past each other. So, on the left, okay, what colors did I use? Green for myosin. So here we have our myosin in the middle. Thick, right? Here we have our myosin in the middle, thick. Actin, I use blue. And then the actin are the thinner ones. Actin is blue, thin. Well, at rest, there is a space in between this. There's a space in between here. But when a muscle contracts, the myofilaments slide past each other. So if I had my fingers almost interlocking between my hands at rest, when a muscle contracts, now it's like I'm holding hands. The fingers are fully interlocked. So there was a gap between the ends of the actin. Well, here, because the actin and myosin have slid together, there's no longer a gap. Something else that happens, there's a space in between the actin and myosin during relaxation. And even though they don't do a great job of showing it, during contraction, these will touch. The actin comes down and attaches to the myosin. They touch. Okay. So just know the basics. At rest, the myofilaments are arranged pretty close to each other, not yet touching. At rest, the myofilaments. When a muscle contracts, the myofilaments slide past each other. Right? The myofilaments slide past one another to cause contraction, and there's no longer a space. When the muscle shortens, it pulls on the bone it's attached to, and that's how we have movement. Right? Here, her biceps are relaxed. Biceps brachii relaxed, right? Here, they're contracted. And when the myofilaments slide past one another, it pulls on the bone it's attached to, and then the forearm, therefore, moves up. All right. We've got even more to talk about. I know. Here we go. Because there's so much involved. One of the good things about getting into this is that you're going to start to see how complex things really are. And remember, we're just beginning. I mean, I'm giving you a pretty cursory explanation. I'm trying to simplify it a little bit. So it's even more complex than we're talking about. But it's pretty amazing that all these parts work together properly every time we contract a muscle. Pretty cool. All right, so another really important piece of anatomy is something called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This is a little sleeve, series of tubes. It's a little sleeve, porous sleeve, or a series of tubes that covers the myofibril. This whole thing is the myofibril. But look, we have this blue little porous sleeve. Porous sleeve that covers myofibril. And why do we even care about this? Because these sleeves store calcium. Once we go through the steps of contraction, we're going to see that in order for a muscle to contract, in order for the actin and myosin to be able to slide past each other, we have to have calcium present. Have to. If you don't have calcium, muscle's not going to contract. So therefore, it is quite helpful to have a little area right inside the muscle, right, surrounding the myofibril that stores calcium for us. All right. So here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking that we'll talk about the steps of muscle contraction. It's going to be detailed, complex. You may want to listen to it over and over again, study it over and over again, write it out, say it out loud, listen to it over and over again, whatever study technique that works for you. After we finish this portion of the chapter, we'll pause the video. So I'll finish this first video, and then we'll finish the rest of this chapter in the second part of the video. Okay, so muscle contraction. Before you even start to study this, I mean, please, by all means, listen to what I'm going to say. But when you sit down to study, my suggestion is that you first study the anatomy. Don't even try and study this until you know the anatomy, right? You know, oh yeah, there's a big muscle, and then it has these fascicles, then it has these muscle fibers, then the myofibrils, then the myofilaments. Actin is thin, myosin is thick. Covering the myofibril is a little sleeve that stores calcium called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Because you're only going to be able to follow along well or to learn these steps of contraction if you know the structure. Now, once you are experts on the structure of the muscle, now we can move on. So what is the absolute first thing that has to happen for any kind of muscle to contract, skeletal, smooth, or cardiac? There's got to be a nerve impulse. There's got to be a nerve impulse, an electrical impulse sent from the brain. There's got to be a nerve impulse going into the muscle to tell it to contract. So here's how it happens, right? This here is the nerve, right? The nerve comes down from through the spinal cord in the brain, exits the spinal cord, goes out to whatever muscle that you want to contract. At the end of each nerve are these tendrils, which is kind of cool because these tendrils wrap themselves around the muscle fiber. Well, if we were to look at where that nerve ending meets the muscle, there's actually a gap. Even though it's really hard to see in this picture, where that little nerve ending contacts the muscle is a little gap. Now, this whole region is called the neuromuscular junction, which should make sense, folks. It's the junction between the nerve and the muscular system. Neuromuscular junction. Here's an up close. There's a gap. Look at that gap in between the nerve and the muscle. That's called a synapse. So the first thing that has to happen for any muscle to contract is that there's got to be a nerve impulse from the brain. So a nerve impulse travels down from the brain, down to the nerve, down through the tendrils, and ultimately, if we ended there, that nerve impulse would reach a dead end. So how are we going to continue that nerve impulse across this gap? A nerve impulse is an electrical current. You can't just have that current jump over a space. So how we might be able to call this step 2, how do we get the nerve impulse from the nerve into the muscle? And the answer is a certain type of chemical called a neurotransmitter. The most common neurotransmitter, almost always in skeletal muscles that is released, is called acetylcholine, ACH. So each of these little dots, I guess they're blue, right? Each of these little blue dots is a neurotransmitter, usually acetylcholine. It is that acetylcholine as a chemical that crosses the synapse and binds to the surface of the muscle. Neurotransmitter. It transmits the nerve impulse across the synapse. Here's the real picture of a nerve ending coming down. And as I said, a nerve ending has these tendrils that wrap around the muscle fiber. I love this picture. Okay, so now that we've established the very first thing that has to happen for a muscle to contract, it has to be a nerve impulse that gets into the muscle. We established how that nerve impulse is going to cross the synapse through a chemical called a neurotransmitter. So now we have that nerve impulse in the muscle. I just yawned, I'm so sorry. So now we have that nerve impulse in the muscle. What happens next? Okay, I'll remind you, as you already know by now, there's no essays on a quiz or an exam in this class. But I will ask you questions about these steps. Maybe you have to put the steps in order of muscle contraction. Maybe I just ask you a quick question about one of the steps. So you do need to have a basic understanding of these. Okay. This is called the sliding filament theory, how a muscle contracts. Why? Because we have actin and myosin lying horizontal to each other. Well, it's only 3. Hold on. We have actin and myosin that run horizontal to each other. In between are the thicker parts called myosin, actin. Okay. So when they contract, the actin and myosin come together. The muscle fiber shortens. This is called the sliding filament theory. If every place along the muscle fiber shortens, then the overall muscle is going to shorten and or contract. Sliding filament theory. Here are the steps I am breaking it down into. I am leaving out some things, trying to give you an idea of what really happens without overly simplifying it, but I do think it's important to get into some of the details. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's see. Cross bridging, that's 5 steps. Maybe 6 steps total. All right, so here are the steps. We already talked about number 1. The nerve impulse travels to the muscle, and we have to have a neurotransmitter cross the synapse between the nerve and the muscle. And usually in skeletal muscle, that neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. So nerve impulse travels into the muscle, goes all the way down to the end of the... Hold on. You can see I'm a little tired this afternoon. I'm so sorry. The nerve impulse travels to the muscle. This will be a better way of saying it. Nerve impulse travels to the muscle, but then it's got to get into the muscle. Right? So acetylcholine goes into the muscle and then binds to the muscle fibers. So nerve impulse travels to the muscle. Acetylcholine crosses into the muscle thanks to a communication from acetylcholine. Once we have acetylcholine binding to a muscle fiber, this process alone stimulates the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This calcium leaves the sarcoplasmic reticulum, travels down into the myofilaments, binds to actin. Calcium binds to actin. When actin gets that calcium, actin and myosin touch, causing actin and myosin to touch. They don't slide yet. Not yet sliding. So we don't yet have movements. But there's this preparatory step called cross-bridging, where the heads of the myosin attach to the actin. Once we do that, then energy is released, which causes the actin and myosin to slide past each other. This is what is known as the muscle contraction. All right, so let's review. The nerve impulse travels to the skeletal muscle. Acetylcholine is what crosses the gap from the end of the nerve into the muscle. That acetylcholine that comes in will bind to the muscle fibers. That will cause calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Calcium goes deeper into the muscle to the actin and myosin. Specifically, calcium binds to the actin. And then myosin will then touch actin. Once the calcium binds to actin, actin and myosin will touch. In other words, form a cross bridge. They're not yet sliding, but they touch. And then immediately after that, a little bit of stored energy is released to cause actin and myosin to slide together, which is the contraction. So here, it's kind of a weird picture to look at, and I do understand that. But it gives us some idea. So number 1, nerve impulse comes down. Number 2, acetylcholine, ACH, crosses the gap into the muscle, which then triggers calcium to be released. When calcium is released from the SR, calcium will bind to actin. Once calcium binds to actin, it causes cross-bridging. The myosin head perks up and just attaches to the actin. After cross-bridging, right, this is cross-bridging, when the actin binds up to actin, causes the actin and myosin to be touching, cross bridge, but there's not yet any contraction. Right after the actin and myosin touch, then energy is released, stored energy, and the actin and myosin slide past each other. This step is also known as the power stroke. The actin and myosin slide past each other, otherwise known as the power stroke. And this is when we have shortening of the muscle contraction. Right? So cross-bridging is just when they touch, no sliding yet. Power stroke is when they actually slide past each other. This is the muscle contraction. Now, keep in mind, there are many nerve impulses needed to really sustain a contraction. If I just went through that whole process once, I would have a muscle twitch and it'd be done. But if you want to have a sustained contraction, your brain has to keep sending many nerve impulses. So you end up contracting all the time. Now, it's not a huge problem because after each contraction, your body's able to kind of keep it a little bit close together. So it's not like it has to go through all the steps every time. But it still needs nerve impulses to keep telling it to stay contracted. Once you get a nerve impulse to your skeletal muscle that says stop contracting, then the muscle will relax. The actin and myosin will rebound back to their original position. This cycle continues until there's no more calcium. So the cross-bridging and power stroke continue to cycle as long as there's calcium present. All right, let me just peek ahead really quickly. Talk about motor units. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that. Okay, still have a little bit to get through here. Oh yeah, I love motor units. Okay, so we were just talking about the microscopic functioning. We were looking at the actin and myosin microscopically in here. And each little unit of actin and myosin, called a sarcomere, shortened. And if every little unit shortens along here, then the overall muscle shortens and contracts. So hopefully we get that microscopic view. But what about a little bit further out? So I like this picture because it introduces a motor unit. The motor unit, make sure you know the definition. The motor unit is one nerve and all the muscle fibers that nerve supplies. Innervase is just a fancy word for supplies. So in this picture, the orange is the motor unit. I'm going to color it green. We have one nerve coming out. The orange one. This nerve has branches, little tendrils that go to one muscle fiber, two muscle fibers, three muscle fibers. That together is the motor unit. The one motor neuron and all the muscle fibers it innervates. This is a relatively small motor unit. These would be for muscles of our face and our hands and our feet, where we only have 3, 4, 5 motor units. Or 3 to 4, 5 muscle fibers in each motor unit. Other times, we can have a larger motor unit. Let me turn one blue. There is another nerve coming out of here. What if I had this one going to all? That would be one nerve with 5 motor units. It would take only one nerve impulse to contract all 5 motor neurons. Muscles that are big, like your quads and hamstring, they're going to have really large motor units where one nerve can supply hundreds of them. You can come on in. Hello.
Dear.
I'm just recording. That's okay, though. We'll just say hi.
Okay.
Unless you have a good dirty joke you want to share to my students. Ha, we joke. Right? So in small muscles, the motor units are small. That one nerve has tendrils that only go to 10 muscle fibers. But in large muscles, you're going to sit them down. Thank you very much. But in larger muscles, that one motor nerve goes to 100 muscle fibers. So it's very efficient. Think about your hamstrings. For every one nerve that goes into your hamstrings, that one nerve has tendrils that go over 100 muscle fibers. So one nerve impulse will contract 100 fibers. Very efficient. So we can get a lot of contraction for just one nerve. So the name of the game in the large muscles is efficiency, because I need the most contraction as possible. So I get a lot of contraction with sending only few nerve impulses. In smaller muscles, the name of the game is more about control, fine movements. Your hands, your fingers, one motor nerve may innervate 3, 5 muscle fibers. It's not very efficient because your nervous system has to send more nerve impulses. But because they're smaller, you're able to do more fine movements. Okay, now there are some really important rules that these motor units abide by. One of them is something called the all or none principle. So let's take our large example where we have one nerve with 100 tendrils. And that goes into, here's my muscle. That one nerve innervates 100 muscle fibers. The all or none law, all or none principle says that within a motor unit, either all muscle fibers contract or none contract at all. Within one motor unit, within each motor unit, either all the muscle fibers it supplies contract or none. So, for example, in this example, if I send a nerve impulse down this nerve, then I'm going to contract those 100 fibers. It's all or none. It cannot be such a thing where that one nerve innervates only 50 of 100. Out of 50 or 100. It's not possible to have that one nerve innervate only half the muscle fibers it supplies. No, can't do that. Either that one nerve is going to contract all 100 muscle fibers or none at all. Now, you may be asking, well then how do I change the overall intensity of a muscle contraction? Because look down below. Each muscle fiber contracts at the same intensity. Each of those little muscle fibers contracts at the same intensity. So how then do we differentiate between a really strong muscle contraction or a lighter one? Well, for a strong muscle contraction, I can't even talk. If you're trying to lift a really heavy weight, your body's going to stimulate more neurons. For a weak muscle contraction, you will stimulate less or fewer neurons. Let's say to the hamstring, let me go back. Let's say to the hamstring muscle group. Let's say to the hamstring muscle group. The hamstring muscle group is on the back, right? Let's say that there's 10 total nerve endings that go into it. There's 10 nerves going into the hamstring. Now, if I contract one of those nerves, remember, if I contract one of those nerves, all its muscle fibers have to contract, or none at all. But because there's 10 nerves, for a weak contraction, maybe I only need to activate one nerve. If it's a really strong contraction, maybe I've got to activate all 10 of the nerves. So we can alter intensity by contracting more or less nerves going into a muscle. But for each individual nerve, all the muscle fibers that nerve innervates will either contract or not. So here's what I just said. You have it. You have me saying it with my voice, and you have it written down. So hopefully, we can really get that through to you. All right, we're getting towards the end here of our discussion of muscle contraction. And it's kind of a discussion of how the muscle contracts overall. I already alluded to this, but now I want to make sure that we really talk about it. If we send one nerve impulse, so if the brain only sends one nerve impulse to a skeletal muscle, the muscle will go through the steps of the sliding filament theory once. Nerve impulse into the muscle, acetylcholine crosses the synapse into the muscle, calcium is released, calcium binds to actin, actin and myosin touch, forming a cross bridge, stored energy is released, which causes the actin and myosin to slide past one another, and that is what a contraction is. If we only go through those steps once, you'll only have a twitch. The best way to understand this is if, something like you get a bug going towards your eye. The muscles around your eye will contract once to help you blink, and then you're done because you've blinked at the time that the bug might be coming in your eye. But it's only once. But most of our life activities require a sustained contraction. If I'm lifting a weight, if I'm running, if I'm walking, if I'm writing, even the muscles of my finger when I'm writing. So if we only were to send one nerve impulse, you'd only get one muscle contraction. It's kind of like a twitch. Muscle contracts and it's done. My eyelids close because there's something buzzing near my eye, then they open. That's it. But most of the time, we require a sustained contraction, not just a muscle contracts once and it's done in a millisecond. We usually want a more sustained contraction, a smooth contraction where I'm walking, I'm contracting my muscles over time to walk, to lift a weight, to write with my pen. When we want to have a sustained contraction, we've got to send many nerve impulses. Actually, for as long as that muscle stays contracted, your brain will continuously send nerve impulses to it. This process, there's something called summation. And this means that after you have the muscle twitch, and when you send a nerve impulse down that nerve quickly again, the effects of the nerve impulse tends to summate. And I think this is the best picture. Bear with me here. So if I have one stimulus, a stimulus is a nerve impulse. So if my brain sends one nerve impulse to a muscle, the muscle is stimulated once. If I have one nerve impulse, I have one set of contractions, muscle contracts, but then it quickly relaxes. Twitch. One nerve impulse, I have one set of these contractions, leads to the overall muscle to contract, and then it relaxes. But if I start sending more and more nerve impulses, their effects begin to summate. I send another nerve impulse, steps of contraction occur, muscle again contracts, begins to relax. But what if I send another nerve impulse so quickly? So oftentimes your brain will send successive nerve impulses so quickly that the muscle didn't have a chance to relax the whole way. So when it gets another stimulus, it will begin to contract again, but now we've contracted a little higher with more force. Okay, so summation. When you begin to send nerve impulses so quickly that the muscle hasn't had a chance to relax fully from the nerve impulse before it. So the effects begin to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So you can see summation. The effects begin to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Now at some point there's something called incomplete tetanus. This is when you have a quivering contraction. You're almost to that sustained contraction where it's smooth, but you're still sending nerve impulses so quickly. The effects begin to summate, and eventually we get to a point called incomplete tetanus, where the muscle is twitching so quickly that there's like a quivering overall contraction. But of course, after a period of time, overall, we have so many nerve impulses that we reach this steady state. And that's when the muscle is fully contracted. This process happens over a period of a really short period of time, a millisecond maybe, probably even less than that. But all I'm saying is, even though you don't realize it, because when I go from relaxation to a complete tetanus, even though you don't realize it, if you were to break it down, these are the steps that's happening. But the steps go quicker once you have all the nerve impulses you need. Okay, the one last ingredient. We talked about needing calcium. We need acetylcholine. We need a nerve impulse. Something else we haven't talked about yet is fuel. And this goes back to our previous 2 chapters on energy and energy systems. We remember, this is how we produce ATP. This is how we produce ATP, which is our usable energy source. So in order for those myofilaments to slide past each other, we got to have ATP. We get that from creatine phosphate initially. We get that from anaerobic glycolysis next. And then we have the benefit of producing energy aerobically. During, sorry about that. Got a little carried away, didn't I? So cool. Okay. I'm a little spaced out today. I don't know why, so I apologize. Okay. So we need ATP for the actin and myosin to slide past each other. If we're doing a really short contraction, the ATP is provided by the creatine phosphate. If we're trying to sustain a contraction for about 30 or 40 seconds, we're going to get our energy or ATP from glycolysis. But most sustained contractions, because they last longer than a minute, 90 seconds, are getting their ATP from aerobic respiration. All right, let's take a break from this video, and we'll come back for part 2, dealing with the muscles themselves.